All right, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. We might give you all, or not all of you, we might provide 1 or 2 more minutes for anybody else, any stragglers that we may have to join. Thank you for tuning in, and we're looking forward to tonight's event.
Peter, where is that photo taken that's behind you, that's projecting?
This is in the Chocó of Ecuador, in the Ecuadorian Andes. So it was a cloud forest, whoever said that. I think Richard mentioned that. Yep. Yeah, just earlier, beginning of last year, maybe in February or so. But have you been there?
Bilsa Biological Station?
This was in Mashpi. You should check it out.
The place we were at was in Esmeraldas.
Oh, that's a nice area. Very cool. Well, you guys ready?
Sure.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to our final night of our X Prize Rainforest LA Natural History Museum Tropical Thursdays. This is our 4th installment of this series and final one. So we're really excited to wrap this up tonight and have another exciting conversation about exploring your own backyards. And again, tonight we are joined, as last time, with Brian Brown, the head of the entomology department at the LA Natural History Museum and curator of entomology, as well as a new guest, Richard Hayden, who joined the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County to project manage the new master plan design for the La Brea Tar Pits Museum and surrounding landscape. And tonight we're going to talk a lot about the gardens of the Natural History Museum and how people can garden in their own backyard for native wildlife and the biodiversity in the area. And once again, I am Peter Houlihan, our technical lead for the Rainforest X Prize, a $10 million 5-year competition to enhance our understanding of tropical rainforests around the world. And I'm just really excited to make more connections on a local level in terms of biodiversity in our own backyard to tropical rainforests around the world. Tonight's a really great opportunity to do that. So thank you guys both, and thank you, Brian, again. Richard, welcome.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here. I just want to add one thing, and that's that I'm also the garden director of the Nature Gardens right now. So I have a little garden background, been with the museum off and on since 2012. So.
And that is what we're going to talk about a lot tonight.
Yeah.
I hope you brought some photos.
I did. I actually did. Do you want to launch into just a little background about what the Nature Gardens is? Brian was involved in the original planning. I'm going to share my screen here and we'll show a couple of slides. And basically, the Nature Gardens used to be an asphalt parking lot. Let me see, there we go. You can all see that, I hope.
That's good.
It was an asphalt parking lot in 2012, and there was this great idea that scientists from the museum would be able to study urban nature. They would build this garden, and we would catalog and kind of keep track of what kind of nature would show up. And it was a great opportunity to, especially in this particular neighborhood, which is, kind of South LA, there wasn't a lot of nature going on, and it's an opportunity where we get to interpret to our many students that visit and almost 1 million visitors a year that there is this wonderful nature all around us. And some of the components of the Nature Gardens include, we have this wonderful pond, and this includes all California native plantings, and we have one fish that's inhabiting the pond, and that is the arroyo chub.
One species of fish.
One species of fish, yes. Thousands of them now. They've successfully kind of taken off. And I'll just say that the one thing I'm disappointed, if we're talking about biodiversity, I'm disappointed we don't get more herons coming in fishing for the fish. I think the fish keepers would feel differently, but I think the ornithologists would be thrilled, and I'm a big fan of herons.
We have had a great blue heron visit, though, sitting on I saw it sitting on the roof
Yeah,
right in the
I
background.
actually have that picture. It was outside my office, but it
Yeah.
didn't swoop down to eat any fish. So I'm waiting for that to happen. But it's a great opportunity, and you'll see in a little bit what we do with some of these rocks that are around the pond. It's an opportunity for engagement and to do a little bit of science. And so we really try to make it an immersive experience. So there's this, what we call the urban wilderness, which is once again, all California natives, trees, shrubs, underplantings, creating, lots of space for habitat, for nesting, for all sorts of animals, lots of squirrels that are not necessarily native to Los Angeles, but, naturalized. We have this wonderful living wall, which was actually a design aspect that separates kind of the public area from the area where you would need to have a ticket. But it also gives us this opportunity to talk about plants that grow vertically on cliffs and things like that. You can see right here some beautiful dudleas that are a California native succulent. And it also just gives, an extra kind of wonderful richness from this beautiful argillite sandstone that we've discovered is, I think, over 1 billion years old. It's from up in Montana, from where we get some of our fossils from. We have a lot of areas that are really engaging for kids. This is the urban water feature, which is kind of part of the water story that we tell. You start at the pond and there's a dry creek that takes you down. And this is kind of the representation of what happens when the LA River reaches downtown Los Angeles. And then we also have the pollinator meadow, which was the last garden we planted. And it's so interesting because we saw a different richness of biodiversity show up when we created a meadow that had different kinds of plants. We had Lincoln sparrows, and I'm sure Brian can talk about some of the other bees and insects that showed up when we had these different kind of plantings. Here's another, this is our original 1913 building in the background. So you can see the garden really wraps all the way around the museum. And then we did these really fun chalk signs that can get switched out as a way to kind of interpret what's going on. We do have some features. These are, Brian can talk about these. These are a great little device that we use to talk about the ways that our native bees actually reproduce.
Yeah, those are parts of my back deck from my house. Basically, we had some extra wood, so I drilled some holes in it and put it out as bee hotels. There are many kinds of bees that use cavities in wood for their nests. Most bees don't make big colonies like honeybees. They just make individual nest holes or they use individual nest holes that they pack in with nectar and pollen and rear their young in those. So this is just a way to provide habitat in kind of a quirky way for our garden.
And we also have an area of bare soil where we actually message that a lot of our native bees actually nest in the ground. So that's one of the aspects that we ask people to do when they're gardening at home, is to leave a little spot of bare soil. And then I just want to give a shout out to the Get Dirty Zone, which is a real hands-on place for primarily kids to learn about what soil is. And if we're talking about biodiversity, I just want to make sure that I give a shout out to the biodiversity that lives in the soil. And there's a whole soil food web of amoebas, bacterias, and all sorts of organisms down there that are working hard to decompose and to create plant food. And it's certainly one of the things I'm sure that hopefully you're looking at when people are looking at ways to look at the biodiversity in the rainforest. Is there's a lot going on beneath our feet, and a lot of opportunities to sequester carbon, but that's a whole nother presentation. So, and then we do, as I mentioned, we do get a chance to interpret. Remember these days when we used to do fun things without masks and walk around giving tours and have school kids do ponding exercises and look for organisms that might be in the water? So that's pretty much let me stop sharing here. There we go. That's the overview of the nature gardens. I don't know, we also have some other projects that we do and the ways that we interpret. And one of those is the community science projects that we do. We have a big community science organization, and Brian can talk a little bit about some of the projects that we're doing in the Urban Nature Research Council.
Center. Urban Nature Research Center is our program to try and engage the population of LA with biodiversity research. We have a number of projects, including BioScan, which is the one I'm most involved with, in which we were collecting insects in people's backyards and gardens. We have one called Rascals, Reptiles and Amphibians of Southern California, which attempts to get people to make observations using iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is a platform or an app on your cell phone. So you go out and take pictures of lizards. And
got a great lizard picture I'm going to share right now. There we go.
So we want people to take pictures of lizards and submit them to iNaturalist so that we can understand the distribution of lizards. One of the interesting things about the Nature Garden is that unlike much of LA, there are no lizards there. And we're not 100% sure why. That was one of the early projects that we did, was to try and figure it out. I mean, sure, it's because, in some respects, it's because the whole place was bulldozed flat in the construction process, but lizards haven't moved in from the surrounding areas. And there's a lot of reasons why. But anyway, we want to study lizards and their behavior and distribution. Another one of our projects is called SLIME, Snails and Slugs Living in Metropolitan Environments. It's the same thing, iNaturalist photos of snails and slugs, which is maybe a less well-known part of our biodiversity, or less appreciated, but really, really interesting, because there's so many native species and species that have been accidentally introduced into our area. It's really important that we understand how those are distributed. And nobody else is looking for these things.
And what about the Widow Wars, Brian?
The Widow Wars is a more recent one. Another one of our projects is the spider survey. We had that since 2002, I believe. One of the first things we found in the spider survey in Los Angeles was that black widows were getting outcompeted by a new invader, the brown widow, which is a species originally from South Africa, as far as we know. But it got introduced into LA, and it was in a small area, and then it just exploded everywhere. And now just basically under every piece of lawn furniture in Los Angeles County, you can find brown widows. And one of the ways we're trying to understand how they were able to so successfully colonize the LA area is to figure out what they're eating. It's surprisingly little known. So we're asking people to take photographs of widow spiders, like this brown widow, with its prey, which is a green fruit beetle. And in this way, and take those photos and submit them to iNaturalist. And in this way, hopefully we can understand a bit more about the interaction between these two species. The black widows are just about disappeared from the urban area, and the brown widows have really taken over.
And that's happened just in the last 6-7 years. It's been a really fast kind of interesting invasion.
I think it's happening all the time with the spiders. Spiders are good hitchhikers on human commerce and containers and so on. So when we look at records of what was present in Los Angeles in the spider fauna 100 years ago, and we do have some papers about this, that it was quite different than what we have today. And today, as we're doing our spider survey over the last since 2002 at least, we're finding new species are always coming in, and they're displacing other species that were there previously. So it's like waves of these species coming through. It's really an amazing dynamic that's going on. And I saw a question there, how do you tell the difference between a brown widow and a black widow? What I say is look at the widow shape or the hourglass shape on the bottom of the belly. The black widows have a red hourglass, and the brown widows have a Caltrans orange hourglass. It's pretty simple to see the difference between those.
The other easy way is actually the egg sac.
That's
The brown widow egg sac is spiky, and the black widow egg sac is smooth, if I remember correctly.
For
Right, if you
those
see-
who are flipping them upside down to identify the species,
Yeah.
there's a question from Eileen in our audience. Is there a difference in the venom between these two?
Hmm.
Well, the main difference is, well, both of those spiders are not really that aggressive, but the brown widows are really non-aggressive. They're just what I call fraidy cats. If I see one and I don't want it there, I just sort of flick it, and it curls up in a ball or runs away. So I'm not saying anybody else should do that. I'm just saying that it's not an aggressive spider. You would have to work really hard to get bitten by one of those. And
In addition to some of the backyard arachnids and other biodiversity, I'd love to learn a little bit more about how the gardens at the museum, what people can learn from them for their own backyards, maybe for landscaping, or we've talked a little bit about commercial areas in LA, greening different spaces, providing corridors for a variety of different species in the urban landscape. Um, any immediate thoughts on navigating some of those topics, or maybe Richard, you had a few different points previously about the different natural habitats that are represented in the gardens at the museum.
Right, and one of the gardens we didn't show you, we kind of called a formal pollinator garden. But what we tried to do was to show different kinds of plants that are great for pollinators, but they can be used in a more traditional backyard. There's a great plant I'll give you just a quick picture of, which is one of Brian's favorites. It's called Coyote Brush. And it's blooming right now, and it is crazy for the amount of pollinators that come to visit it. Let's see, there we go.
yeah, it's just seething with insects for 2 or 3 weeks in the fall.
And
Really
the way
spectacular display.
it is, and the way we used it is to clip it like a traditional hedge. So it could take the place, and it's a California native plant. And it could take the place, it uses a lot less water, and it could take the place of boxwood and a lot of the more traditional things that people are using for hedges. In fact, I was just looking at it today, just mesmerized at the different kinds of insects and wasps and different things that we're visiting. So that's one of the ways that we're kind of messaging to folks, is that it's super easy just to get some ideas of things that you can do in your backyard, and you can start small. You can just start with a few native plants. I mean, the secret too is that you need to plant more than one. A lot of times pollinators can't find you unless there's a certain critical mass. So 3, 5, start to get your pollinator garden going. And it can be the other thing that Brian has just a few opinions on is the amount of commercial space and parking lots that, have stupid landscaping that doesn't contribute at all to biodiversity. Am I right, Brian?
Right. There's a lot of plantings in factories and commercial areas that is biologically inert, basically. Nothing comes to it. Nothing uses it. So it doesn't provide food and shelter for any, or hardly any, wildlife. So why not replace those with some native plants that provide some of those resources and help our native wildlife?
Yeah.
But the other big number one thing that we need to do is get rid of lawns.
Yeah.
Speaking of providing benefits, we have another question from Ezekiel. Do you harvest seasonal fruits and vegetables in the garden?
Well, we actually do, because it is a habitat garden, and people need food. And so we have a big edible garden. We've got a series of fruit trees and edibles, and we try to have a lot of different cultural things that people can relate to. but yeah, we've got apples and blueberries and oranges and persimmons, and the persimmons are just coming in actually. And if we were open, I'd say, come on down, we'd share persimmons with you. But we're also doing bananas and grapes and just a wide variety of different kinds of fruits. And actually, Brian himself is quite the fruit grower up where he lives.
Yeah. One of the big problems with growing fruit in the LA area is squirrels, of course. You got to be able to keep those squirrels out. That's another one of our projects, is the squirrel project.
All right.
There's native squirrels and there's introduced squirrels here in LA. The introduced squirrels are highly damaging to our homegrown backyard food gardens.
Our first installment of this series, I chatted with Miguel Ordiniana
Yes.
about
Yeah.
the squirrel program. So anybody
Excellent.
listening interested in squirrels in your backyard in LA or anywhere, tune into that one for sure. Kind of building off of getting back to attracting wildlife to your yard, maybe squirrels are desired or not. But what would you guys recommend if people were looking at planting those 3 or 5 plants? What would be some of the best ones for the area, possibly to support endangered species, or what did you recommend in addition to what you already shared?
Well, I have a couple of photos here. Let me just pull these up and let's see if we can make this work. So this is one of my favorites. It's called coffeeberry.
Yeah, that's a good pollinator plant.
Yeah, and
Not
it's
only for honeybees.
well, I know this happens to be a honeybee, which is a European honeybee, not originally from, of course, very much naturalized. But you can see how small these flowers are, right? Those little tiny green flowers are, the size of a bee head. And the reason small flowers are so important is that a lot of our native bees are very small and they respond to these size flowers. So this is a great plant for in fact, Brian sent me a bunch of pollinator pictures, which we have time we'll look at. But I was surprised, Brian, you didn't send me any pictures of flower flies. And Brian's expertise is our flies. So they are important pollinators. So this is a great plant. And then also what you get with this is you get these beautiful berries, which is why it's called coffeeberry. And then of course the birds very much come in, the cedar waxwings and such will come in and feast on these plants. The reason I love this plant is because a lot of California native plants, especially after being dry all summer, don't look all that great. And this is one that really holds its beautiful green color and its presence, and it takes sun or shade. It's very, very forgiving. What else do I have here? Oh, any of our native, oops, let me go back. Native sages are great. On the left is, I think, Cleveland sage. On the right, the kind of fuchsia is called hummingbird sage. So the salvia species are great. The Cleveland sage on the left is actually great for bees. It's great for butterflies and also for hummingbirds. And then in the fall, this time of year, the seed sets and the finches come in and just have a ball with it. And then the other thing too is that if you rub the leaf on this sage, for me, it smells just like California. It has this minty chaparral, sagey kind of smell that you can't mimic. And on a warm day, the whole garden will smell that way.
One thing I was just going to add, as we're talking about bees, can you elaborate on which bees specifically and which we want and which bees we don't want? Sure.
There's probably 300 or 400 species of bees in Los Angeles County. We don't know exactly how many, but it's an incredibly diverse fauna. And the one bee that most people recognize is the European honeybee, or the Western honeybee, as Richard said, which is an introduced species used in agroecosystems for pollinating plants. In my opinion, we don't need to encourage these things in the city. There's enough of them in feral colonies. What we should be doing is encouraging the native bee species, some of whom are running out of habitat in natural areas because their plants, their host plants, they're very highly specialized on certain host plants. Unlike honeybees, which are basically like cows, they'll eat anything.
Perfect.
Here's one of our native bees in a mallow on the left here. I don't know which one that is, Brian. Can you tell?
That's a I'm not sure exactly which species. That's one of the native bees, though.
No
Or do
pressure.
you mean which mallow?
Oh, which mallow? That's easy. That's desert mallow.
Desert mallow. Yeah, those ones with pink flowers are highly attractive to this and to the metallic green sweat bees.
Right.
Yeah,
And
so I just
then,
wanted to emphasize on that point. Thanks for explaining that, because I'm not sure how many people, when we talk about planting native species, there's a lot that goes into it. So yeah, Richard, it'd be great to continue with a few of these, but just
Sure.
for people to understand, some species aren't native, and sometimes we're attracting the wrong ones. But in general, these are great ways to really support the native biodiversity.
Absolutely. And speaking of a great bee plant, any of our native buckwheats, these Eriogonum species, are great. I don't have a picture of the ashy leaf buckwheat, which I know is Brian's favorite. It is just a swarm of pollinators this time of year. On the right, though, is St. Catherine's lace, or giant buckwheat. And these, once again, are each one of these florets is many, many tiny little flowers put together. So it makes a great bee plant. And they bloom over a long season, and they come in different colors. This is a great plant that actually was introduced by our former garden director, Carol Bornstein. It's called Purple Cedros Island Verbena, Verbena lilacina delamina. It's from, so the California floristic province actually goes down into Baja California, and Cedros Island is off of Baja. And this is a California native that's a great bee and just a really wonderful butterfly magnet.
Is that a Western tiger swallowtail?
Western tiger swallowtail. Yeah.
Very good, Peter. Yeah.
Awesome.
And
Never looked that west, but they look like the eastern ones.
yeah. So that's what I had for plants for just some of the greatest hits.
Love it.
And of course, a lot of the natives we don't have pictures of, but the California poppies and the phacelias and a lot of the native wildflowers, the annual wildflowers, are really great.
Very cool. And when we're talking about landscaping, we're talking about all the different native wildflowers here. Why might, Brian, why don't you like lawns? Why don't you like lawns in a green manicured way?
Well, number one, they use too much water, so they're not very sustainable. And also, from studying the flies that we work on in the city, we know that there are huge numbers of fungus associated flies that are present because of all the water that's going on to those lawns. So that's got to be affecting the native biodiversity in some way as well. Also, many types of native wildlife don't like that lawn. They can't move around in it. They can't nest in it, like bees. Those ground nesting bees need dry, open soil. So I think the number one thing we could do to improve the biodiversity of our city is rip out the lawns and replace it with bark mulch and native plants as
There
much
are
as possible.
there are a few native sages that get only a foot tall but get 12 feet wide, and they're really good at holding the soil together, and they make great lawn alternatives. And I'll just add two more things that another reason to reconsider your lawn is, one is lawnmowers are really polluting. They don't have the same controls that cars do, and they create a lot of emissions, and a lot of lawnmowers are gasoline powered these days. And then the other one is the amount of chemical fertilizer that goes on to make a lawn green just adds it, a lot. If it's over applied, and if it's inorganic, it actually affects the biota of the soil because they're not used to all of that chemical presence. So if you eliminate, having to put all that inorganic fertilizer and all that gasoline to mow it and all of that, non-habitat, there's not a good reason really to the only good reason to have one, let me just say this, the only good reason to have one is if you have kids or pets that are actually using it as a surface for recreation. And to that end, we actually at the Nature Gardens have a display of different alternative turfs that you can use, some of which are native, so they use a lot less water. Some of them actually even flower, so they do provide a little bit of habitat value. So that's another way to go.
And are those alternatives widely used in the area?
You know, they are getting more and more widely used to the point where I know of one sod grower that has a whole line of California native sod that they're growing.
Okay.
So for, you know, welcome to California, where, you know, I want it today and I want it looking like it's always been there. So you can actually order up your native sod now and get it installed. But you want to make those areas very, very small, you know, just what you need for the kids to play or the dog to run. And then, you know, have the rest of it be the kind of plantings that actually contribute to the habitat value of everything that's going on in biodiversity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, some people oftentimes may not enjoy planting all native species. We're getting into it's October. And so maybe not as many things are blooming this time of year.
Well, you know, and it's interesting. There's a dialogue. I was a landscape designer for 20 years in Los Angeles, and I'm you know, working at the nature gardens has converted me to think about every time I choose to plant a plant, I think about what habitat value it has now.
Right.
And that wasn't always the case. There are the set it and forget it freeway plants, which are great when you have limited maintenance, but they don't really provide anything. Another thing that's been going on is the climate is changing. And I've noticed in Los Angeles that we're not getting significant rain in July, but we're getting monsoonal flow. We're getting a few thunderstorms now in the summer. And there are areas of the country in Arizona and Texas, et cetera, where the plants are more used to a monsoonal situation. And some of those plants are coming in now to the trade, and they have better summer appearance, right? Because they're used to getting a little bit more water. So some of the there's some Texas sages, for instance, that we have in the nature gardens that are great because they do look good all year round because they're used to getting summer water. They don't, like some California natives will just freak out if they get too much water in July and August. They're just not used to it. So
There are some hybrids too that are able to extend the season and look better.
Yeah.
Like that backrest that you showed.
Right, exactly. And then there are the things that are growing, you know, maybe in riparian situations where you would find creeks and rivers, and those are a little bit more forgiving of water, summer water as well. And in the nature gardens, we're only about 70% California natives, so we try to make sure that we're messaging. We want people to have a way in, however we're going to get them into the idea of planting for pollinators and habitat.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point as well to note, you know, we're talking throughout this whole series, we've been talking about wildlife in your own backyard, plants in your own backyard. And what you mentioned about climate change as well are noticeable ways in which, you know, people are observing the impacts of climate change on your own gardens. A lot of these, you know, people experience climate change in many different ways. And one prevalent one is just by, you know, noticing the shifts in flowering of your own species, the timing of when different insects or birds may come to your yard. And so that's an interesting component, I guess, as well of making these observations of the biodiversity and understanding the natural history of LA.
Another category of plant we didn't talk about is trees.
Absolutely.
Don't leave them out, Brian.
Well, I was going to let Richard do
well,
that.
You can never go wrong with a keystone species of tree pretty much anywhere, and that's the oak tree.
Okay.
The California live oak, which I don't have pictures of, but everyone can pretty much picture what that looks like. It is the premier keystone species, and it supports over 250 different insects and animals. Just, you know, and what birds need, I'll just put a plug in for ornithology here since Brian's the entomologist. Birds need caterpillars to feed their young. So caterpillars eat trees primarily. So if we don't have the kind of native trees that caterpillars like, we don't have the native birds. So oaks, sycamores, we have some willows, we have some alders. And then, you know, once again, some of the desert species are coming in and turning out to be really good. We've got desert willow, chalopsis trees, which are a really nice, small, make a good street tree. And we have Parkinsonias, which are Palo Verdes. Oh, there we go.
I realized we can just Google this.
Yeah.
Your California live oak.
Yes.
That's an impressive one. I actually learned how to climb trees when I lived in Florida on live oaks. So different species, but closely related. And
Yep.
just remarkable structure of these trees, especially, I mean, a great tree to learn how to climb just without ropes, but very impressive.
I did see a question about synthetic grass, and let me answer.
Yeah, let's go back to that.
Let me answer Anne's question. I have a few opinions about synthetic grass. You know, once again, it's if it makes sense as a play surface or a surface for your pet. You have to be careful though, they get very hot in the sunlight, so they will burn pets. The biggest problem is, once again, is that what is it doing to the soil life? And so and what is it doing to the tree roots? So as something to cover the ground to look at, I don't think it's a great alternative. But if you need a small patio area or play area, it can work. But it, as far as I know, is not recyclable, that kind of plastic. So we have to be also thinking about what the end use of it might be. So in small situations for pets or animals or children, maybe it makes sense, but the heat can be an issue.
What is used, or I guess preferred, for larger, I'm thinking of like sporting events and soccer fields, football fields.
Yeah.
Is there something that's preferred in that realm?
Well, there's both now. They're using a lot of artificial turf. They are developing supposedly artificial turfs. First of all, they're looking better because they're blending in different colors and making them look more like natural.
Sure.
And there are some that are being developed for temperature control, but you still probably need to rinse it off and water it down, especially if you've got pets. Sporting events, that's just a lot of water to keep it green and keep it alive, but it's a full-time thing, especially for Dodger Stadium, for instance, or any of the professional ballparks.
Very cool. Thank you, everybody, for the questions so far. We're going to open up in a few minutes to even more questions and more of a Q&A session. So feel free to send those, and we'll continue answering them as they come in. Brian, do you want to add a little bit more about the entomology of pollinators in the area, and what are maybe some of the most important ones? What are maybe some of the less well known publicly, or even, we could even talk about, we had a conversation about monarchs as well, and misconceptions about the monarch populations in California. So I think this is a great just general opportunity to talk about pollinators and these larger ecological interactions that people can support in the area.
Well, the best way to support the native pollinators, of course, is to plant the native plants. Many of the pollinators are associated very strictly with certain plants, unlike honeybees, which can use just about any kind of flower. So, there's all the different kinds of native bees. I'd like to say that you can provide habitat for them without doing anything, with actually just taking away a little bit of your habitat with a drill. So if you drill holes in some fence poles, you can make habitat for those bees, leave some bare soil out, again, like Richard said. There are many other insects that are pollinators as well, like flies. As Richard said, there's flower flies that are not as well known as bees, but are probably just as important pollinators. And everybody loves butterflies. So there's certainly individual plants that you can plant to attract large colorful insects, if that's what you want to do, such as cassia, which is it's a legume, isn't it, Richard?
Yep, it is.
Yeah,
it
attracts
pea family.
Right. It attracts the big yellow sulfur butterflies, cloudless sulfurs, really easily. And if you plant native milkweeds, you'll get monarch butterflies. And if you're going to plant milkweeds, that's the one you should plant, not the not the tropical milkweeds that
I do have a milkweed picture here that you sent me, Brian.
Right. Those are the desert milkweeds. Those are a specialized one, right?
Right.
So they attract in our gardens some very interesting pollinators, such as the tarantula hawk wasp there on the left, which is probably close to life size on your computer screen at home. They're really big.
And super painful.
They use nectar for fuel, but the way they develop is they go out and they find spiders, big spiders like tarantulas and trapdoor spiders, and they sting them and take them back to their nest, which is a burrow in the ground, and they'll lay an egg on them. And the egg hatches and the larva feeds on the paralyzed spiders. And then on the right, we have another type of wasp. It's a sphesid wasp. Has roughly the same sort of lifestyle with other types of hosts. But when you plant the native milkweeds, you get all kinds of interesting insects coming in, not just the monarch butterflies.
And one thing to add, I think, too, while we're going through this, and Brian, as you're explaining, is you continue to keep describing new species to science in your own backyard. You're attracting all of these different species, and what people should know is that there's an incredible diversity of insects in the LA area, and not everything has even been described yet.
Yeah, there's estimates that there are 3,000, 4,000 species of insects in the Los Angeles area. I think that based on our sampling, it's closer to 20,000 species. A lot of those are tiny things that most people won't see, but the point is that the biodiversity here is huge and it's largely unknown still. Things like these blue darner dragonflies are well known, of course. There are good guidebooks for the dragonflies of California. Putting in water features in your backyard is something you have to do with care here in Los Angeles, because unless you have some kind of control for mosquito larvae, you can be promoting mosquitoes that carry diseases here in the city. And in the last few years, as climate has changed, mosquitoes have moved farther north that we didn't used to have here. So we have Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, which are mosquitoes that can transmit human diseases like yellow fever and dengue and Zika virus. So we want to keep those out if we can. And there's lots of native insects that will show up in a garden. Even a really small one. A few years ago, I made a garden for a balcony in an apartment building. I put in 3 plants, cost $20, and I had flower flies coming in within a few hours. So you can have a pollinator garden in a space as small as,
And as the gardener, I want to give a shout out to flower flies, because their larvae will eat a lot of garden pests like aphids and different insects. So not only are they great pollinators, but they're little gardener helpers, because they'll eliminate some of the pests. These are just a couple of pictures that I've snapped with, I have the advantage of always being in the garden a lot more frequently. So, nowadays when we have a camera in our pockets, it gives us like this little, I don't know which species of praying mantis that is. Brian, any ideas?
I don't know either.
It's super.
So we get a lot of these little fiery skipper butterflies.
Yeah.
And then we have a tremendous amount of hummingbirds. We've got a hummingbird feeder and a garden that was planted for hummingbirds. And this is an Allen's hummingbird. And you can see the nest construction for hummingbirds is, I think, beyond anything. They actually collect spider web and then wrap the outside of the web with the spider web, and then put in some lichen and some other things for camouflage. And then as the chicks grow, the spider web expands and allows the nest to grow as well.
You can have hummingbirds almost anywhere in Los Angeles. You put out hummingbird feeders, you'll get them, or plants that attract hummingbirds. I know somebody who lives on the 21st floor of a building downtown.
Oh, yeah.
And she has hummingbirds on her balcony. So really great ambassadors for wildlife.
Yeah, the urban canopy. And Richard, one thing I'd love to just add on a different note is your comment about taking photos. As a photographer, a lot of people constantly ask me about how to take better natural history photos. And to be honest, I mean, one thing we often say is the best camera is the one that you have.
Mhm.
And the other aspect is just being out there as much as possible. So it's definitely a huge asset to be able to be out in the gardens all the time. Usually, we have a couple great questions coming in, and one that I really like the scale and scope of this from Susie. On a citywide scale, what are the big things cities could or should be doing to make our spaces work better for people, plants, and insects? So we've talked a lot about our own backyards. We've talked a little bit about across the city, but um, on much larger scales, I guess. What do you guys recommend?
Well, one of the big movements that's been going on for a couple of years now, and it's really kind of important, is the concept of the watershed, that every aspect of every place is part of a greater watershed, and people are paying attention to how the water flows, how the stormwater that falls on your property should primarily stay on the property, because then it can infiltrate and become groundwater. And so thinking about getting people's minds around the idea that there is this watershed gets them to understand that they're part of an ecosystem, right? And they can see that, and Brian can attest to this, that when you start to put together this backyard with your neighbor's backyard and your neighbor's backyard, that you really can create a wildlife corridor where we can connect, our pollinators, our birds, and our other animals, give them a way to connect between the wild places.
Yeah, and even if we can't, having some open space, we can have a mosaic that many animals will use as well. And it's been shown in studies that mosaics, as long as they persist, like open land, as long as they persist for a few years without getting, bulldozed or whatever, they can act as reservoirs for wildlife that shifts around the city. So I think that it's pretty hard when you've got a huge area of commercial development to have a wildlife corridor through it. But many animals can use these shifting mosaics as transport, as habitat transport or habitat distribution loci as well.
I noticed shortly after we started quarantining back in March, the gardeners weren't coming, so the lawns weren't getting mowed, right? And I was taking my morning walks and noticing that there were suddenly some weeds popping up, and suddenly there was a flock of bluebirds hunting on this one lawn that hadn't been mowed. And all it took was just stopping the mowing for a couple of weeks, and suddenly the habitat was showing up. It doesn't really take a lot. Nature is resilient,
Yeah, it's been interesting this year. Early on, people were talking about how hopefully certain aspects of everything shutting down would be beneficial environmentally. I think globally that hasn't necessarily been the case in terms of other things that have picked up in large scale. But the way that wildlife returns to spaces has been fascinating to see. It doesn't, in that respect, it doesn't take that much time. And one thing that I'll just on that note, earlier this year when I was first in Florida for the pandemic, several parks were closed that typically were used for a variety of different activities and things like that. And as soon as one of them opened that I always enjoyed going to, my father and I ended up going out for a hike, and we shifted direction to the last minute and just thought maybe we'll go down this one trail that nobody's been on for the past 6 weeks and just see what happens. And within, I don't know, 10 minutes or so, we were walking right behind a bobcat for about a mile that was, we had never seen there before, but was just calmly walking along. And, after about 20 minutes of us following it, it freaked out. But it's interesting, just those anecdotal accounts of seeing how wildlife responds to people and understanding that our species, Homo sapiens, are a part of these landscapes, and we are the ones that impact it the most. And so, in our own backyards, where we can improve the habitat, um, it does layer into those mosaics that benefit a much larger scale. So, um, yeah, it's been an interesting, definitely not a predictable or planned or desired experiment, but it's seeing these things really inform our impact on the planet. We have a couple more questions coming in. Getting back to mosquitoes, uh, what insects are mosquito predators? And I think that in responding to this, we can certainly expand this to even beyond what insects. Anybody want to take this one?
Well, sure, dragonflies are big mosquito predators, but a lot of mosquitoes are active in the evening or even at night, and things like bats feed on them as well. And many night flying birds like swifts feed on mosquitoes. But if you've got a problem with mosquitoes, you've got a problem with standing water in Los Angeles. That's the main thing you've got to look for. Mosquitoes can develop in an incredibly small amount of water. So if you've got potted plants with saucers under them, make sure that there's not water standing in those saucers. Just about anywhere else where there could be standing water, that's the way to get rid of mosquitoes, because this isn't really a bad mosquito area generally.
Yeah. And even in addition to that, the life history of mosquitoes starts, as you were saying, in water. In Florida, there are fish that feed on mosquito larvae in the water, and a variety of other, even like dragonfly larvae and things like that. So they have many predators throughout their various life history stages.
Right. The problem is with small backyard pools that don't have the full complement of things like fish and so on.
Exactly. That's why we need healthy ecosystems. Another, getting back to iNaturalist, when we have an anonymous, somebody didn't want to put their name out there, but that's okay. When we take a picture of a certain species of animal and post it to iNaturalist, do we hashtag the Natural History Museum?
No, those are automatically, I think those are automatically grabbed by the taxonomic group, like any reptile or amphibian that comes in LA County automatically goes to Rascals and so on. Yeah. But you can join those projects and take photographs directly for them if you want.
And iNaturalist has expanded all over the world, so it's definitely something to check out and contribute to. It's a very, very cool platform.
And I also think that we're using hashtag nature in LA. If you're on Instagram, those will also get grabbed, and community scientists, they were mining that. If they still have the efforts, they can grab those off of Instagram and Facebook.
Very cool.
The museum is one of the homes of a worldwide iNaturalist project called the City Nature Challenge, where I can't remember how many cities now. It's a huge number, but all over the world for 1 week in the spring, they compete to see who can get the most observations on iNaturalist. And it's been tremendously successful.
Are there, speaking of just these different eco regions in the LA area, I'm not sure, what the COVID situation is like and travel in the area, but in terms of, I imagine a few parks and natural areas are accessible. Are there any of your favorite places that you enjoy going just in the area to get out during this time? See some native plants?
Well, I think the museum garden is closed again, is it not, Richard?
We're opening for Spider Pavilion. Tickets are on sale now if they visit nhm.org. But you need a Spider Pavilion ticket in order to visit the nature gardens at this point. We're patiently waiting for the county to give us the go-ahead to open indoors. But
other great places are the Arboretum, LA Arboretum, Rancho Santa Ana Botanical Garden, and the Huntington Gardens as well. all of those have interesting plants. I'm sure there's other places, but I have an East End bent.
One other thing you mentioned, I think you mentioned a figure maybe about 70% or so at the garden are native.
Yes.
So can you provide a little bit of information about what non-native species can still be beneficial, or what do you recommend non-native species in any way, or when might?
Well, so in our, we have non-natives more in, for instance, in the formal pollinator garden where we're trying to mimic, I think the design aesthetic was more of a kind of English garden feeling. So we have like things like kangaroo paws from Australia, which
Okay.
are a really striking plant, but they're great for hummingbirds, even though hummingbirds aren't native to Australia. So it makes me wonder who's pollinating them in Australia, but that's a for instance.
Sunbirds probably.
Yeah. We have also, there sages are from all over. I think they occur on 6 of the 7 continents. So many of the sages, even though they aren't native, are great plants. Trying to think of other things as I'm walking through the garden.
Food garden, of course, the edible garden.
Yeah, in fact, there was, Brian was talking about this. I think it's an annual Biden, which is a little daisy flower plant that actually hitchhiked. I don't know if you knew this, Brian. That plant hitchhiked in on a seed mix, and it started blooming and started being very, very popular. And now it is just a pollinator magnet. So it's interesting how sometimes nature can, I call it garden design by serendipity, but it ends up being, really, really popular. We also have lavenders that are great for bee plants and also butterflies. I'm trying to think. There's we have many succulents that bloom as well. There's a wide variety of agaves, which bloom only once, but those are great bee and hummingbird plants. And then another plant, and I can't remember the common name, but it's Dahlia gregii, and it's from Arizona. And it seems like it always is blooming, and it has very, very small flowers, but Brian loves it because it's just a pollinator powerhouse and seems to always be in bloom.
Yeah, the native bees really like it.
Small flowers.
Awesome. Well, guys, it's been a pleasure chatting. We're just coming up on time, and I hope that people learned a little bit about their own backyard tonight and ways that people can support biodiversity in the area, and also learn and observe from their own gardens in their own backyards, and hopefully get back to the Natural History Museum gardens some point in the not so distant future. From us on the X Prize end, today we wrapped up our early registration for our competition, but we have regular registration going all the way until March 15th. So people tuning in over these last few sessions, feel free to check that out. It's rainforest.xprize.org. And again, guys, it's been a pleasure, and thank you to Natural History Museum in LA. I can't wait to hopefully be able to check out the museum myself sometime. So, yeah.
Well, we'd love to have you, Peter. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been great talking to you.
Likewise. Have a great night.
Okay, thanks, Peter.